Thank you very much for that warm welcome. I'm thrilled to be here. I love talking about this topic. It's a real treat for me, and I hope you enjoy following along. So as you've just heard, I'm a philosopher, and one of the things that philosophers do is take positions on things and present arguments to defend those positions. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to defend the claim that yes, there is an obligation to go to Mars, and I'm going to do it by an argument, which I'm about to tell you. Although to be specific, I'm actually going to argue for something that's in one sense a little bit weaker than an obligation and a little bit stronger than Mars, as you'll see as we go along. So here's the argument, okay? And I'm gonna present it to you like this, and then the rest of my talk will be explaining and defending each of these three premises from which the conclusion follows. So the first premise, there's a reason to promote the good. Second premise, if there's a reason to promote the good, then there's a reason to promote the continued existence of human beings. Third premise, the lifespan of the planet is finite. It follows from this, there's a reason to make human existence possible on another planet. Now, so I'm going to go through and I'm going to say more, I'm going to elaborate and defend each of these three premises from objections. But before I do, I'm mostly going to go in order, except I'm going to say a little bit first about what I mean by the third premise, that the lifespan of the planet is finite. Now, you might think that the argument I'm about to make is one that's sort of an anti-environmentalist argument. Maybe, we're all doomed because of climate change. We just got to leave the planet and forget about it. So go ahead, keep polluting, don't recycle, whatever. But that's not the argument that I'm making. I'm not making that argument at all. In fact, the other premises of this argument also lead to the conclusion that we have very strong reason to forestall the effects of climate change. It also follows from those premises that we have reason to make life possible on another planet. So what I really mean by the third premise is something more long range. It has to do with facts about stars like our sun. They have a natural lifespan. It's about halfway through its life right now. So what will happen over the next 5 billion years is that stars like our sun have a core that's made of hydrogen. It's gradually being converted to helium through a process of nuclear fusion. That's why it burns so brightly and nice and hot. But over time, the fuel that fuels the star, the sun, gradually runs out. And then what happens next is that the sun expands. And as the sun expands, it engulfs first Mercury, and then Venus, and then guess who's next? The planet Earth. But before it gets to that point in roughly 5 billion years, long before that, in fact, because the sun is expanding, it will actually be so hot that Earth will be guaranteed to be completely uninhabitable by that point. Roughly 1 billion years from now. So still sort of a long time from now, but perhaps not as long as you might think. Now that's just the sort of guaranteed deadline for when the planet Earth will be completely uninhabitable. And of course, there are many other things that might happen between now and then that would count as a sort of extinction event. Several of those have already happened throughout the Earth's history, as far as we know. It's why there aren't dinosaurs around, for example. So the point being that no matter what, there's going to be some endpoint to the Earth being habitable. So that's just a little bit to elaborate on premise 3. Okay. So now I'm going to go through and say a little bit more about each of my other premises and defend them. So the first premise, as you might recall, is this one. Premise 1, there's a reason to promote the good. Now what do I mean by the good? I don't mean to invoke anything controversial. We don't need to have solved all the mysteries of philosophy to think that there are some things that are good. What I have in mind roughly here are things such as the ingredients that make life worth living for human beings and or for other creatures that also have lives. So this might be things like happiness, the experience of true love, the insights of physics and philosophy, the experience of art and reading and poetry, those things, whatever they are that makes life go well, those are things that are good. So that's all I mean when I say the good. Things that have intrinsic value is the sort of philosophical term for that. Things that are good for their own sake. Things, that is, that make the world a better place. And the world is better when there are more of them. So when we say that there's a reason to promote the good, this is simply to say the sort of near tautologous thing that when some state of affairs has more good in it than some other state of affairs, that counts in favor of bringing about the better state of affairs. So it's just the fact that something would be better counts in favor of bringing it about over and above the fact that a state of affairs that would not be as good as that. So it's very simple and straightforward, basically a platitude about the good. In fact, some philosophers actually argue that the definition of the concept of what it is for something to be good just is that which we have reason to promote or reason to bring about. So that's what's meant by that. Now, you don't have to buy that definition of the concept of the good, I think, to be on board with this general platitude that if something is better, that counts in its favor. So that's all that's meant by this. Now, it's worth pointing out, and this is important, that the reason to promote the good, in the way I've just described, isn't undermined when there's already a lot of good stuff around. So to see that this is the case, consider an example, a favorite example of philosophers. Suppose you're walking by a pond and there's a person drowning. Okay? So of course, you have a reason to rescue the person who's drowning from the pond. In fact, you have a moral obligation, it seems, to rescue the person so long as you can do so. And the reason, this obligation that you have, isn't weakened by the fact that there are already lots of other people living in the world. Okay, we can't just say, oh, whatever, there are lots of people living, I don't need to save this one. Okay, no, you've still got to save the person. Okay, so that point will become important later. Okay, so this really is the first premise of the argument. There's a reason to promote the good. Now, I'll just say one other thing. So even if you don't buy this premise, it's worth noting that the argument goes through even with a much weaker premise. And that's something like this. Having a universe with some good in it is better than having a universe with nothing in it. I'll return to that later. So let me move on to my second premise. Okay, this is probably the most contentious of the argument. If there's a reason to promote the good, then there's a reason to promote the continued existence of human beings. So a relationship between human beings, creatures like us, that is to say, and promoting the good. And there's 2 points of support that I'm going to make for this claim. One of them is many of the greatest goods that we know of essentially involve human beings. So in that sort of hand-wavy list that I generated a moment ago of the things that we think of as generally being the greatest kinds of goods, let's see, what did I have? I had knowledge, love, art. Those all, by and large, involve human beings in some way. Now, I'm not saying that only human beings are involved in good things, or that all the greatest goods imaginable in the entire universe necessarily require creatures exactly like us. The claim is simply that of the goods that we know of, many, if not most of them, essentially involve us. So this is also compatible with there being many other varieties of goodness in the universe, just the ones that we know of and the ones that we are pretty sure are pretty darn good goods. They essentially involve creatures like us. Now, the second point of support, and I'm going to elaborate on this shortly, is that having rationally autonomous moral agents, I'll explain that later, in the universe is very important for securing the possibility of a future with some good or some value in it at all. Okay, so I'll tell you more about exactly what I mean by that. But first, let's consider some objections. So here's one. isn't it possible that the Earth would be better off without us? In fact, another philosopher, his name is Todd May, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a while back, maybe 6 months ago, maybe longer, I think actually now, arguing that because of the damage that human beings are doing to the various ecosystems and wildlife, you can actually make a case that it would be much better if we just went extinct and let this beautiful verdant planet and all the animals just run around and the trees bloom. And there might actually be more intrinsic value in a planet with no human beings than there would be in a planet with human beings. Now, of course, I've just given some examples of the greatest goods that involve human beings, essentially. But still, let's suppose that Todd May is right about this. Let's suppose that the planet Earth, with just this beautiful, verdant, pristine wilderness planet Earth, would in fact have more intrinsic value without human beings than it would with them. That's great for the next billion years. But at that point, of course, the only creatures who had a chance of developing the technology to make life possible on another planet will have gone extinct. Namely, that's creatures like us. So that would be it, arguably, for the end of anything that's good, at least on this planet, if not elsewhere in the universe. So if there's a reason to promote the good beyond, say, the next billion years, that reason, it's not like it expires in a billion years, it's always a reason that's there, then there's a reason for human beings to keep going even now in the interim. So this is a much more long-range argument than other philosophers are making, or anyone as far as I'm aware. Okay, but you might think, what about other planets with life? Isn't it possible, in fact probable, given the vast number of galaxies and solar systems and candidate Earth-like planets, that elsewhere in the universe there are other planets that are developing intelligent, valuable life? You might have heard of the Drake equation. I don't know if anyone knows what the Drake equation is. It's not the Drake who you think if you haven't. It's Dr. Frank Drake, who is an astronomer. And he developed a way to capture how we would calculate the probability of there being intelligent, communicative life on other planets. So it's a pretty cool thing. If you don't know about it, you can just Google it. You can find it on the SETI website. There's a good rundown of exactly what it is. So it's a matter of calculating how many stars there are, and then the various likelihoods of there being candidate Earth-like planets that could develop life, then develop civilizations, intelligence, and so on and so forth. So you might think, look, so there's some evidence that there's a non-zero probability, that there's intelligent, valuable life out there with some of these great goods floating around in some other galaxy. Now, while it seems a non-zero probability, unfortunately, one of the most recent reworkings of the Drake equation using the known data and some tools of mathematics. This was done by a mathematician at Oxford. The latest reworkings of this actually show that the best estimates, the worst case scenario, best case scenarios of there being other intelligent, well, this is communicative life, but other communicative life in the universe is actually much lower than has previously been thought. So the sort of worst case scenario is that it's 99.6% chance that we are alone in our galaxy. Of course, that's just our galaxy, though. There's a lot more universe. And still, worst case scenario, 85% chance probability that we are alone in the observable universe. So in other words, it's highly likely that the value that there is ever going to be in the entire universe is right here on this planet. Now, it's important to recognize that the claim that I'm making is not that the value that we have is so special and better than any other value that other species could have. It's just that this is all there ever could be. This might be as good as it gets, and that might be better than, say, nothing. So again, it's not necessary for this argument that this is in fact the only planet with any intelligent and valuable life. You remember my drowning in the pond case? So for the argument to go through, even if there is some other civilizations with intelligent, interesting, happy, good lives out there, that doesn't undermine the fact that we would still have a reason to promote our continued existence. So remember the drowning pond. So it's not just because there's other intelligent life out there, doesn't mean we should, whatever, let's just like crash into the sun, we can just let those other planets take over. No, the people who are right here and our future generations over whom we have some control about their existence, that the fact of that future good gives us a reason to continue it into the future. Okay. Oh, right, I said that. All right, here's another objection. And this, I hope this already occurred to you. What about bad stuff? So one of my points so far has been that human existence is very important for all the greatest goods. So, interestingly, it seems like human beings have also been really essential to almost all, if not in fact all, the greatest evils that we know of. So a concern might be, if we're promoting the continued existence of human beings into the future, that might end up with a universe that has more bad in it than good. Now, that's true. I think we have to accept that there is no guarantee that a future that has human beings in it will in fact have more good in it than it will have bad in it. However, and here's the other point that I hinted at, the continued presence of rationally autonomous beings always makes possible a future with some good. So now I need to explain what I mean by rationally autonomous beings. So this is, so the philosophers in the room will recognize this term, and perhaps some of you won't yet, but will now be inspired to learn more about it. But what's meant here is simply beings that understand and recognize reasons and are capable of acting on those reasons. So human beings are among the creatures who can do this. We can recognize that something is a reason for us to do something. And those reasons can, in at least some cases, be contrary to what our instincts or impulses or desires are. And we can adjudicate among the strengths of the reasons that we see and that appeal to us, and weigh them against, say, other reasons, reasons that we have in virtue of our desires or in virtue of our self-interest. In other words, we're capable of thinking and reflecting on the kinds of things that we do and the reasons why we do them. So if there's a reason to promote the good, or a reason to do the right thing in some very general sense, we're the kind of creatures that can recognize that. So for every subsequent generation of human beings in the future, no matter how bad things are, there's always a possibility, because we're capable of doing this, because we're capable of recognizing reasons and responding to them, there's always a possibility that things will improve and that people will respond to the reason to promote the good. So even if we can't guarantee that a universe that has people in it, or creatures like us, will have more good on balance than it will bad, as long as there are creatures like us who can recognize and respond to reasons, we can guarantee the possibility that there will be some value in the future. Just the possibility. Okay. So, to summarize, then, I've made these 2 points for why human existence is necessary for promoting the good. The first one was that it's an essential part of many of the greatest goods that we know of. So our continued existence makes more likely the possibility of these goods. And secondly, that rationally autonomous agents or creatures like us are capable of responding to the reasons to promote the good, and so guarantees the possibility that there will be a future of value. Okay, I've already said a little bit about the third premise, That's the finite lifespan of the planet. So let's consider then some objections to this way of looking at things. So given that, so the conclusion, or at least the title of this talk, is that there's an obligation to go to Mars, we might think about that specifically. So here's an objection to that as being the first step in what we should do next to promote continued existence. It's the finitude and the feasibility of colonizing Mars. So what do I mean by this? So remember when I described the lifespan of the sun, of stars like our sun? So over the course of several billion years, it will gradually cool and expand to become a red giant. Of course, it will engulf first Mercury, and then Venus, then Earth, then Mars. So we can't stay on Mars forever, in other words. And indeed, that's right. So this is not the end point of the argument. So all of the same reasons that we have to make human life possible, to make human existence possible on Mars, are actually reasons that we have to go farther than Mars, to find another solar system. So it might sound a little extreme, but it turns out that we actually do have reason to master interstellar travel. And the argument that I've made here has the conclusion that we, in fact, have reason to make life possible on some other planet, whichever ones we might find in which we can do that. So this also addresses the feasibility question. So many people who worry about colonizing Mars worry about the fact that, say, for example, there's no atmosphere there, let alone oxygen, which means that the radiation from the sun just goes right through. So it's going to be pretty hard for us to survive there. So indeed, that's true, but that shouldn't deter us, since it's going to be impossible for us to survive on Earth, or on Mars for that matter, for any long period of time. So this is simply a challenge to the task, not an objection to doing it at all. Another major concern, so as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people who object to colonizing Mars do so on the grounds that it's sort of bad PR in the face of climate change. So we have only so many years left that we know where Earth will be habitable in virtue of climate change, so that deadline is encroaching on us much more rapidly than the sun's expansion. And so we might think that we really shouldn't be focusing so much attention, we shouldn't be advertising the fact that there's planet B out there that we can just sort of go and settle on and then just ruin that one and move on and so on and so forth. But as I said before, it should be pretty clear from my argument that the same premises also support the conclusion that we should do everything that we can to ensure that the Earth is habitable for as long as we possibly can. The point is to promote the good in whatever ways that ends up taking. So the very same reasons that we have to go to Mars give us reasons to forestall the effects of climate change or any other impending disasters that might make life here impossible. For example, fending off asteroids that might be coming our way. It's really a thing that might happen. So it's not an objection to this argument that we should be paying attention to climate change and focusing our resources there. Another mistake that people often make is to think that somehow it's a zero-sum game of what scientists are doing. So as if it were the case that people who are currently now developing rocket technology could just switch over and work on building more efficient electric cars or something like that. But of course, we can do all of these things. There's lots of really smart scientists out there doing lots of smart work, and the future scientists here, I'm sure, will go off to continue to do all of these things. So one doesn't preclude the other. We can do both of these things. And in fact, we should do both of these things. Okay. Now, of course, given the temporal proximity of the real disasters that may befall us with climate change, it's pretty easy to argue that there might be more urgency in terms of addressing those issues and things that we can do to prevent that than there is about going to Mars. The deadline is, the latest possible deadline, after all, for habitability on the planet is 1 billion years. So we do have some time, But given the challenges with developing technology, there's no reason for us to delay too much. But my point here is mostly this. If you agree, so anyone who agrees that we should forestall climate change, we should also agree with the conclusion that we have reason to go to Mars and continue existence off planet, because the reasons to do so are the same. So here's another major objection that many people have, and it's just to the simple fact that colonization in whatever form is always objectionable. So colonizing Mars is just as objectionable as any other colonization that's taken place here on planet Earth already, and for that reason we should avoid it. Now, to address this, we have to think very carefully about precisely what it is about colonization that makes it objectionable, and whether or not this is a case where those concerns can be avoided or at least assuaged. So colonization is generally considered to be objectionable for at least the following three reasons. It violates the rights of peoples currently living in a land. Secondly, it involves erroneous and objectionable claims of cultural superiority on the parts of the colonizers. And third, the subsequent oppression or cultural erasure of colonized peoples. Okay, clearly, beliefs about cultural superiority have led to some of the worst evils of human existence. So we definitely need to be careful to avoid confusion that the argument here involves any claims about cultural superiority. But I think it should be pretty clear that none of the claims in the argument supporting the voyage to Mars hold that any particular culture is superior to any other culture, or that any culture is superior to anything at all. The claim of the second premise, that the existence of value is superior to the existence of no value, and there's just a reason to promote goodness, is something that I would hope anyone from any culture would recognize is true. Now, I guess it's somewhat obvious that since there are no people on Mars, we don't have to worry, for example, about violating the rights of people on Mars. However, there's another reason why colonization might be deeply objectionable, which hasn't been considered, well, it has been considered by other philosophers, but I haven't considered it here, and that's because, and this concern is this, that it would violate a pristine wilderness. So we might think that colonization of any land and or planet, is objectionable simply because of the prior claim that a wilderness has to exist untouched by human existence. It's a very appealing thought here. Now, it's not clear that Mars has the characteristics that would grant it the status of being a wilderness that would be rendered unpristine by the presence of human beings. We might think that what it is for something to be a wilderness is for it to have some life or ecosystems. So it's not clear that Mars meets this criterion. Nevertheless, we might think that it's possible that wilderness, what it is for something to be a wilderness, doesn't necessarily involve life. It might be that a desert could be a lifeless desert, could be a wilderness in the relevant sense, and therefore have some claim against us encroaching on it. And this isn't implausible, that might be true. So if that is true, that would, to that extent, count against us colonizing Mars. I think we have to admit that. So we can grant, however, that a pristine, lifeless expanse of a planet is a wilderness that has intrinsic value. But it still follows from that doesn't necessarily override the reasons that we would have to colonize Mars. As we saw earlier, potentially the universe is filled with pristine, lifeless planets. And even if we grant that each and every one of them has some value, it's not obvious that the value of just one lifeless planet would outweigh the possibility of all the richness of human existence. It's not obvious. So it's not clear that just one lifeless planet is more valuable or valuable enough to outweigh the thought of extinguishing all the greatest goods of every human civilization that there ever has been and ever will be, not to mention all the other good non-human things that we have going here. Now, the situation may be more complex. So there's some perhaps surprising evidence recently that there's really a non-zero probability that there is in fact life on Mars right now. So you may or may not be paying attention to news about the Mars 2020 rover mission. But in fact, there's enough mounting evidence, given just the sort of Martian climate, so to speak, that there's a possibility that there is continuous, currently living, respirating organisms on Mars. The Mars 2020 rover will actually be equipped with a drill that will drill into the crust to extract rocks. That's the most likely place in which there's organisms. They must be the most likely case is that there are tiny microorganisms that are very hardy that can exist in rocks. So they're going to extract some rocks and take a look. So scientists are now getting on board with the thought that there is in fact, or there may be life on Mars right now, teeny tiny microorganisms on Mars. I mean, perhaps that's just, the best case, or the strongest evidence is that that's the most we could hope for there. So this complicates things because, of course, it would perhaps elevate the status of a wilderness, of the wilderness that is on Mars, to being one that does have some life, albeit very tiny, simple life forms. But nevertheless, we might think that that is enough for them to be granted some kind of moral status. But once again, I think the same arguments here apply, where we'd have to think, of course, carefully about how we can make our existence compatible with whatever Martian organisms there are there. And this is further morally relevant when we consider the possibility of whether or not Martian microorganisms might be harmful to human beings, or whether or not we might be harmful to them. So there's not much that one can say about this except to point out that it's a possibility, and then we'll have to think very carefully about how we develop the technologies and how we set up our existence so that we can all coexist. Even if these microorganisms turn out to be harmful for human beings, it's also important to point out that they're incredibly beneficial to us, at least instrumentally, because of the information that they would provide in their study. Not only does it just seem like it would be intrinsically a good thing to know more about these microorganisms, but they will contain information, say, for example, the biological conditions that support being able to live in a Martian climate, and also information about the origin and development of life more generally. So in any case, we should have learned our lesson already by now, that nothing good comes from despoiling our environment or doubting the worth of other creatures. So if it does turn out that there are living microorganisms on Mars, that certainly brings up some further concerns. Now, there's indeed quite a lot more to be said about this point and all the other points that I've raised, but I'm going to leave it here. So to summarize the argument that we have an obligation to go to Mars, I've actually argued for something slightly weaker, but perhaps stronger than you would have thought. There's a stronger than you would have thought reason to go to Mars, and it follows from two very simple things. One is a very easy to get on board with platitude about value or the good. There's reason to promote the good. The other is simple facts about stars like our sun, namely that they have a finite lifespan. Put those two things together, and it turns out that there's a surprisingly strong reason to go to Mars. Perhaps even more surprisingly, looking far enough into the future, Mars is only the first step, and we have surprisingly strong reason to go much farther than that. Thank you for listening.
We've got plenty of time for questions, so fire away.
You can object to things I said. That's what we do as philosophers. I want your challenges. Go for it. Or anything. Yes.
Well, I'll ask, this is triggered by that Drake formula or equation.
Yes.
And the possibility that we may be alone in the universe.
Yes.
So when you teach related topics like this, anytime you Google top 10 conspiracy theories, Roswell Area 51 is going to come up. Do Rice students, you have students who believe that kind of thing, and if it comes up, how do you respond to it?
That's okay. So, so is the question about like if aliens have been here already?
Which is to say, given the percentages that you put up,
Oh, yeah.
Would you respond? Do you have a feeling that that kind of stuff is absurd, or is it? What's your response when this, or does it come up when when you teach these topics?
Yeah. Well, so I've never taught this in any of my classes. Actually, this is just a research a research talk. I'd love to maybe I should bring this to my class. I don't know if they would ask that question or not. So the question, in case it wasn't heard by everybody, is so how to deal with thoughts about conspiracy theories about, say, Roswell and things like that, and that there've already been aliens here, or that there might have been evidence of extraterrestrial life at some point. I mean, I guess it's possible. I think we need to learn how to look carefully at evidence, and this is one of those cases where it just doesn't seem like there's good evidence for the public to make that kind of decision. I think given the Drake equation, or even just the principles that brings to mind, we have to remain open to the possibility that there are other intelligent creatures somewhere in the universe. On the other hand, the closest candidate planets for life are many, many, many light years away. So they would have to have also developed technology to travel in space for that long. But I mean, it's a possibility. We have to acknowledge that that's possible, if unlikely.
I have a question about one of the objections to the second premise, and this is very hypothetical, but the objection was that human beings cause a lot of evil in the world, right? And so we might have a future that has more bad than good. And your response to that objection was, well, because of rational autonomy, there'd always be a possibility of good. What if we had like a Drake equation that could calculate the probability that some future world was most likely going to have more evil than good because of human activity? Would that blunt your argument a little more? Or?
Oh man, that's great. I love that. Okay, so the question is, what if there were some kind of Drake equation that could, I guess on the basis of human psychology and whatnot, predict whether or not the universe would have, on balance, more bad rather than good if humans were to continue existing? What would that mean about the reason to promote the continued existence of human beings? I've spent a lot of time worrying about this, and the response is in the form of thought experiments. But I don't have a airtight argument for. So it seems that there's a certain kind of value theoretic asymmetry between the possibility of there being a universe that has bad in it, but a teeny tiny bit of good, in contrast to a universe of no value at all. And then the observations that our intuitions about this kind of case change if we're considering a state of affairs where there is lots of value overall, but there's some sort of localized situation that will have more bad rather than good. So to make that, so if we consider, for example, just one teeny tiny state of affairs here on planet Earth where there's already lots of value, and I'm going to tell you that on this teeny tiny state of affairs here, there's going to be nothing but horrendous evils. We might think, that gives us a reason to ensure that that state of affairs does not come about. If possible, we should destroy that evil state of affairs. That seems true only within the context of a universe or a world that already has a bunch of value going on in it. But at least to my mind, if I consider a thought experiment where there's two possibilities of one which involves a future that has a lot of bad in it, but at least just a teeny tiny bit of good, in contrast to a universe that that's totally inert, has no goodness or badness in it at all. And ask myself, would the universe with a lot of bad but a little good be better or worse than nothing? I want to say that the universe with bad but a little bit of good is somehow better than nothing. So, but mind you, that's just a sort of gut reaction in the face of a thought experiment. And it suggests that there's some kind of asymmetry between the bad and the good. Now, that little glimmer of good, I think, may do a lot of work, because we might think that by definition, a universe with nothing but bad in it is worse than nothing. That might just sort of follow from the definition of what goodness and badness is. That's all I got for that one. I've spent a lot of sleepless nights on this, actually. Yeah.
But wouldn't, related to that point, wouldn't there be an historical objection to colonization? When we think about, a lot of students in here have taken 1301 and 1302 about, it hasn't worked out real well when we've colonized, when places have been colonized. Think about the New World, and the Americas when they're colonized, and good came out of that. But that doesn't necessarily justify it morally. So do you see that as a legitimate objection, or how do you take that into account with your argument?
Oh yeah, I do indeed, and that's why, I mean, that's why I'm very careful to address the question of colonization being objectionable, and why it's important that we get very precise about what it is that makes colonization objectionable. And the primary reasons for that, I think, have to do with people. They have to do with one people considering themselves sort of superior to another set of peoples and sort of just running roughshod over their culture, over their existence, over their rights.
Can I interject?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So would that mean your argument would be that the only justification for going to Mars would be if we could do it not on a national basis, but on an international basis, that only if we did it as humanity, because if we do it like the U.S. does it or the Chinese do it, then it's going to be, we'll look at the U.S. or look at the Chinese. So it would, your argument would have to, it seems to me that your argument would have to entail only an international effort would be morally acceptable. Am I reading that correctly?
I think that is a wonderful way to understand this argument. Okay. Yes. So I think it can't, so I mean, this is a sort of practical question, and as a philosopher, I feel like I'm not really in a position to make these like practical assessments, but if the claim is that it's better when there's more good in the universe, if that's the claim, it seems like that's not attached to just one culture and one way of life. In fact, a lot of bad comes from thinking that it is. So to do it, it has to involve people, all of human. In fact, I should also say that it's not just people. So I've just sort of made the argument in terms of human beings, because it's sort of obvious that I think it's obvious that human existence has at least some good things going for it, some of the ones I listed. But of course, there are other creatures on the planet too who have lives that are worth living, and arguably just maybe even things that are not animals, so ecosystems and things like that. All of those things might also have value. So all of the universe would be better if we can somehow continue existence of all valuable beings, or continue existence of valuable beings. Not restricted at all to even human beings, let alone one particular nation. So no, it should not be, I think, a nationalized sort of project. Yeah.
But what if it is? Would you object to it?
Yeah.
I mean, even if it would lead to the colonization of the planet, which might lead to these good things that you want to preserve in the long run. Yes,
this is a great question, and I hope everyone will think about this, actually. So the question is, so really it's kind of like, so look, if something kind of a little bit really bad is going to happen in the short term, but the result of that will be the possibility of a future universe that has some value in it, is that kind of worth it? I mean, one argument is that, well, in the long run, yes, because we have a universe that has some value rather than no value. I can imagine some people thinking, no, we should just knock the whole thing over. If we can't do something like this without making any mistakes at all, then we shouldn't do it. We should just crash into the sun and just go down with the ship. And I can, one can make an argument for either case, and I hope everyone will think about that. Yes?
So I'm not very good at asking questions, so maybe not. How would you feel, like you said, that humans spreading out to other planets would be generally a good thing for survival itself? However, how would you feel about the argument that if we were to do that, because humans cause destruction, we use resources, and we destroy basically everything we touch, how would you feel about the argument that if we went out to other planets, we would eventually use up those resources, use up those planets, and have to move on, similar to a virus or a parasite? And would that be an inherent good for us and bad for the universe, our actual existence?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, and it's a real concern that a lot of people raise about colonizing Mars in general. So, because so far, viewed from one angle, that's kind of what it looks like. So the question was, couldn't we, since human beings are just, we're just going to destroy all the resources that every planet we visit has to offer. So we're just going to be planet hopping, just plundering for whatever we need, and then just, then moving on to the next one. And this seems like a bad thing. Indeed, it seems like a bad thing. And this is one of the major challenges that people often pose to when people start talking about Mars, is the Planet B strategy. There is no Planet B, and we should stop sort of treating our planet like it's just a resource here for us to use and then throw away. But of course, that's something that might happen. One would hope that it wouldn't. One would hope that future generations will be able to look and see about how it looks like we're just running the planet into the ground well ahead of the 1 billion year deadline that we have. And so, we ought to be careful moving forward the future on our planet and also on subsequent other planets, knowing that we really are capable of just totally destroying our environment. And so learn how to make use of the resources that anywhere we live, learn how to make use of those resources in a way that's good for us, the planet, and every other valuable creature in it. So, but it's compatible, I think, with the arguments. Yeah, great question. Yes?
You talked about kind of the thought experiment with the drowning person, compared that to our preservation of humanity. But what if we, just decided to live out our lives and not reproduce anymore? No one would, metaphorically be drowning, of course. But what's your response to that?
Okay, so what if just in general, so actually I'm not quite clear what the question is. So is the question just something like, what if just all of a sudden every human being who is currently on the planet just decides, okay, that's it, we're all done, no one's having any more babies, we're just finishing right here.
And they live their lives out.
Yeah, and okay, so then it's like, well, what happens to the drowning person? So there's no sort of drowning person to rescue. Now, interestingly, so even in the Voyage to Mars case, there's kind of nobody who's in mortal peril who would be rescuing. So it's not analogous to a duty to rescue in the duty to go to Mars. It's just that it's rather that there's a reason to promote the good, even in the face of there being the possibility that there's other good elsewhere in the universe. So one way of understanding a duty to rescue is in terms of a reason to promote the good, because you're preventing the destruction of a good by rescuing. So it's actually not necessary that there be anybody in imminent mortal peril in order to get the argument off the ground, so to speak, to go to Mars. So in fact, if for whatever reason, the entire human race just decided collectively, okay, that's it, no more of us, we're all done, no more babies. Interestingly, we could run, I don't know how I feel about this, we could run the same argument and say that no, there's actually a moral obligation to keep some people around, and so at least some people would have a moral obligation to reproduce. Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't quite thought that my argument had that conclusion. So I don't know. Think about what that means. Yeah.
One more question.
Oh.
Or maybe
Okay.
we can
Yeah.
probably get these two in.
I saw your hand earlier. Yeah.
So know, there's an ambiguous amount of people that want to go, colonize somewhere else. And like, we're like kind of in a race with Russia or like China, everybody else who like, let's say like this was to be international, hypothetically, like whose values would actually matter, whose religion, whose, moral views, part of a moral community sense, like who would matter in that sense?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So how do we decide who goes? I guess that's the question. So how? Yeah. So first of all, so to clarify, so what I meant by the possibility of the future of a universe with value in it, what I mean by that is not sort of values in the sense of any particular thing that people happen to value, but the much more general sense of the ingredients that make life worth living. So rather than, say, some localized value system that's attached to a culture or belief system, what I meant by the possibility of a future with value is just the possibility of a future that has stuff in it that makes the universe a better place. So now, but it is, to get at what that is, it's generally our access to those kinds of thoughts comes attached to some localized belief system, and it's hard to make specific claims about precisely what are the things that we should send off to Mars. As I said, luckily I'm just a philosopher, so I don't really need to worry about the practical details, and it would be a really fun project to try to figure out what is the most just and fair process by which we could decide who to send to Mars in the first colonies or something like that, and how can we avoid making mistakes in this, and what is the relevance of the possibility that we might make a mistake in this process as we do it. So I feel like I didn't really answer your question at all. I just sort of said that's a really hard one, and the answer is that we are all together as human beings going to have to spend a lot of time carefully thinking about how we go about it.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.